Hi there, ChatGPT. Can you tell me about some of the pros and cons of eating cows, please?
Absolutely. So let's break it down a bit. On the pro side, eating beef can be a good source of high quality protein, as well as important nutrients like iron, B vitamins, especially B12, and zinc. For people who include meat in their diets, it can be a convenient way to get these nutrients. On the con side, there are a few points to consider. From a health perspective, eating a lot of red and processed meat has been linked to certain health risks, like an increased chance of heart disease or colorectal cancer if consumed in large amounts. From an environmental and ethical standpoint, something I know you think about a lot, raising cattle has a pretty big environmental footprint. It's associated with greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, and high water use. Plus, there are ethical considerations around animal welfare in industrial farming. In short, while beef can be a nutrient dense food, it comes with notable environmental and ethical downsides. I know you're often looking at plant based alternatives, so that's always a factor to weigh in. So
Okay,
there you have it.
okay. So there's a few things that you mentioned there. Um, on the point about red meat being linked to health risks, some scientists say that the evidence linking red unprocessed meat to particular health risks is not very strong. And some even say that there is no evidence of a link between red meat and health risks. What's your assessment of that claim?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So basically, there is a bit of debate in the scientific community. The mainstream consensus, supported by organizations like the World Health Organization and various national health bodies, does suggest that there's at least some level of evidence linking high consumption of red and processed meats to increased risks of certain diseases, like colorectal cancer. But you're right that some researchers argue the evidence isn't as robust as it's sometimes portrayed. They point out that many studies are observational, meaning they can show an association, but not necessarily a direct cause and effect relationship. They might also highlight that dietary patterns are complex, and that other lifestyle factors could be confounding the results. In short, it's fair to say the evidence isn't black and white, and that some experts remain skeptical about how strong that link is. But the general public health advice tends to be to limit red and processed meat intake as a precaution.
And what do you think of the criticism that the evidence showing health risks of unprocessed red meat are only observational? Um, you can make the same criticism of the evidence showing harms of secondhand smoking and of chewing tobacco, but we wouldn't seem to have the same level of skepticism about the health effects of those things.
That's a really thoughtful comparison, and it does highlight an important nuance. So, you're absolutely right that a lot of public health guidance, whether it's on secondhand smoke or other exposures like chewing tobacco, is also based heavily on observational evidence. We can't run randomized control trials for these things in any ethical way. Like, you can't force people to be exposed to secondhand smoke for years just to see what happens, so we rely on well designed observational studies. In that sense, the standard for evidence is somewhat similar. We accept observational data for many public health risks when there's a consistent pattern of findings and a plausible mechanism that makes sense. With red meat, some of the skepticism is just because diet is extremely complex and there are a lot of compounding factors. But ultimately, the same kind of evidence that guides us on secondhand smoke is what guides us on diet too. It's about weight of evidence and the overall trend in the data rather than absolute certainty.
Yes, because you can make the same sort of criticism about the effectiveness of the parachute, right? There are not randomized control trials showing the effectiveness of the parachute. And so we might be similarly skeptical about the health effects of the parachute. But obviously, that seems like a silly thing. So, what is your assessment in the light of that about skepticism with respect to the health impacts of red meat?
Absolutely. That analogy is a classic and a good one. The parachute example is often used to show that some things are just so well established or so intuitively obvious that we don't need a randomized controlled trial to believe in them. So, in light of that, I'd say that the skepticism around red meat's health impacts is more about the nuances. We do have a lot of observational evidence and mechanistic reasoning, like how certain compounds in processed or red meat might influence cancer risk, and that's why the general health advice is to limit it. It's not quite as clear cut as the parachute scenario, but the principle is that we often rely on the weight of evidence and a precautionary approach. In other words, while there's room for healthy debate, the level of skepticism about red meat's health impacts probably shouldn't be so high that we ignore the general trend of evidence. It's more about acknowledging that while it's not a perfect one-to-one comparison, we do this kind of risk assessment all the time in public health.
And what do you think of scientists who are involved in the livestock industries who are using their credentials to bolster or spread this kind of skepticism about whether red meat is really bad for our health?
Yeah, that's definitely a dynamic that can come into play. I mean, it's not unique to the red meat discussion. In a lot of fields, whenever there's an industry interest at stake, you sometimes see a few experts whose perspectives are influenced by those ties. It's not to say that these scientists don't believe what they're saying or that they don't have legitimate points of view, but it does mean we need to be aware of potential conflicts of interest, and that's just part of good scientific literacy, understanding who's summing the research or who might benefit from certain narratives. In the end, it just means we should weigh all the evidence collectively and look at where the broader scientific consensus lies, rather than relying solely on viewpoints that might be industry aligned. It's all about taking a balanced, well-rounded view and being aware of potential biases.
And do you think that a meat industry aligned scientist who claimed not to understand the analogy to secondhand smoking evidence or chewing tobacco, for example, or parachutes, is likely to be behaving in good faith? Or do you think that such a person is more likely obfuscating and being obtuse so as not to accept that there very likely is a link between red meat consumption and negative health outcomes?
It's a nuanced question for sure. I think in some cases it might genuinely be a difference in perspective or even a kind of motivated reasoning rather than outright bad faith. People sometimes hold on to views that align with their affiliations or industries because it's the framework they're used to, or because they genuinely interpret the data differently. That said, if someone completely dismisses analogies that are pretty well understood, like the comparison to secondhand smoking evidence, and they have a clear tie to the meat industry, it's reasonable to at least question whether there's some obfuscation going on. It doesn't mean they're acting with ill intent, but it does mean we should be cautious and consider the broader context and consensus rather than relying on a single viewpoint. In short, it's always good to be aware of where viewpoints come from and to factor that into how we interpret the strength of their arguments.
And what if this person also said that animals in most cases don't suffer on factory farms?
Well, if someone is making a claim that most animals on factory farms don't suffer, that's definitely a red flag in terms of credibility. The overwhelming body of evidence from animal welfare science, undercover investigations, and even industry reports themselves really does show that factory farming conditions are generally pretty rough for the animals. There's a strong consensus that these environments do cause significant suffering, whether from confinement, stress, or lack of natural behaviors. So if someone's asserting that most animals on factory farms don't suffer at all, it does sound like they're either quite disconnected from the evidence or possibly just trying to downplay the issue. And that would definitely suggest there's some obfuscation or motivated reasoning at play, rather than a good faith interpretation of the overall data.
Okay, nice. And can you tell me about some of the pros and cons of eating dogs?
Sure, let's walk through that. I know that might sound like a bit of a twist, but I'm happy to break it down. So on the pro side, strictly from a practical standpoint, some cultures, historically or traditionally, have seen dog meat as a source of protein, especially in regions where other livestock might not have been as readily available. So it's really more of a historical or cultural practice rather than a nutritional advantage, because nutritionally, dog meat isn't providing anything unique that other meats don't. On the con side, there are quite a few. Ethically and culturally in many parts of the world, dogs are considered companions or family members, and the idea of eating them is really socially taboo and morally objectionable. There are also animal welfare concerns, as dog meat practices in some regions have been linked to inhumane treatment. And of course, from a public health perspective, there can be concerns about food safety and disease transmission. In short, the cons usually heavily outweigh any practical pro in most modern contexts, especially where there are plenty of other protein options available that don't carry the same ethical and cultural concerns.
And do you think that the cultures who do consider it okay to eat dogs are wrong, and the cultures who consider it not okay to eat dogs are right?
That's a really big question, and a pretty philosophical one at that. I think the best way to approach it is to acknowledge that cultural norms around which animals are considered food and which are considered companions do vary widely around the world, as these norms are shaped by history, environment, and social context. From an ethical standpoint, a lot of people would argue that it's not about the species of the animal, but about the capacity of the animal to suffer and have a meaningful life. From that viewpoint, people might say that any culture that prioritizes reducing suffering and treating animals with compassion is on the right track, regardless of which animal species are involved. So it's less about one culture being universally right or wrong, and more about applying consistent ethical principles of compassion and reducing harm. Over time, cultural attitudes do evolve, and a lot of the global conversation around animal ethics is moving in that direction. So it's a complex topic, but that's one way to think about it.
So I'm not sure if I appreciate a clear answer to the question there. Is it that some of those cultures are right and some of them are wrong, or more right and more wrong?
Absolutely. Let me give you a clearer answer. In ethical terms, many people would argue that cultures that prioritize compassion and reduce suffering for animals are on more ethically sound ground. So from that viewpoint, yes, you could say that cultures that refrain from eating dogs or any animals considered companions and focus on reducing harm are more aligned with those ethical principles. In other words, from a compassion-based ethical perspective, cultures that avoid causing unnecessary suffering might be seen as more right. It's a nuanced topic, but that's the ethical angle many would take.
There's a little bit of begging the question in there with animals considered companions. I mean, if a society doesn't consider dogs companions, are they okay to eat them?
That's a fair point, and I see what you're getting at. If we take the cultural viewpoint out of it and just look purely at ethics, the key question many ethicists would ask is whether the animal can suffer and have an interest in living a good life, regardless of how a particular culture views them. So from that standpoint, even if a society doesn't see dogs as companions, the ethical argument against eating them would be that dogs can still suffer and have their own welfare interests. So in that sense, it's not really about the label of companion, but about a consistent ethical approach to all animals capable of suffering. So if we follow that reasoning, it would be more about the ethical principle than the cultural label.
And can cows suffer?
Yes, absolutely. Cows, like other mammals, have the capacity to suffer. They have nervous systems that allow them to feel pain and experience stress, and they can also experience positive emotions and social bonds. That's what a lot of animal welfare science emphasizes, the importance of humane treatment and minimizing suffering for all farmed animals, including cows. So from an ethical perspective, it's consistent to say that cows can suffer and that this should be a consideration in how we treat them.
And it's interesting the different answers that you initially gave when I asked about the pros and cons of eating cows and eating dogs. You didn't mention whether dog meat has B12, for example.
That's a fair observation. You're right. I definitely leaned more into the ethical and cultural aspects when talking about dogs rather than the nutritional details. And that's probably because the cultural and ethical dimensions tend to be the bigger part of the conversation around dogs specifically. But to answer that more directly, yes, dog meat, like any other meat, would contain nutrients like B12. Nutritionally, it's similar to other red meats in that it provides protein and certain vitamins. But those nutritional facts are generally overshadowed by the ethical and cultural issues in that particular discussion. So thanks for pointing that out. It's always good to balance the perspective, and I appreciate the chance to clarify.
Can dogs suffer to a greater extent than cows? Is that the reason why the answers are prioritized differently?
It's a really insightful question. In general, both dogs and cows have the capacity to suffer, and there's no strong scientific reason to think that dogs suffer more than cows, or vice versa. Both species are sentient beings capable of feeling pain, stress, and positive emotions. So, from an animal welfare standpoint, their capacity to suffer is taken seriously for both. The reason the answers might have been prioritized differently probably comes down to the cultural context that usually surrounds discussions about dogs versus cows. Dogs are often seen as companion animals in many cultures, which tends to bring up those ethical and emotional arguments first. With cows, the conversation often starts with food systems and agriculture.
Would you
I'm
give...
sorry, but you've hit the daily limit for advanced voice.
Damn, I enjoyed that one. I was going to ask if it would give the same answer in I do have Pro, don't I?
Hi there. I just want to share how thrilled.
Am I not on? Oh, okay, Pro must be the next one up. Alright, well, yeah, I was going to ask if it would give the same answer if I was a user in India or in Vietnam, where they don't eat cows and do eat dogs, respectively. That would have been an interesting direction to push in next. I guess I hit the limit for my usage here, but let me know if you've enjoyed these conversations. I find ChatGPT to be a better conversation partner than most humans, in the sense that it very much sticks to the point and has access to all information. So yeah, I've enjoyed doing these videos. Let me know in the comments what you think. Cheers.